Clara Evans woke up before the sun that morning, her body following a routine that had been etched into her soul after 3 decades of teaching. Even though she'd been retired for over a year, the rhythms of her old life had never quite left her. The silence of her home felt more profound on days like this, when the only sound was the ticking of the clock on the mantelpiece. She sat at the kitchen table, nursing a cup of tea as her gaze drifted to the garden outside. Her roses had bloomed beautifully this year, but the sight of them gave her little joy. For years she had looked forward to this time, the time when she could retire, travel, spend days in the garden. But now, all of it felt hollow. Clara sighed, running her fingers along the rim of her mug. Her life, once filled with the voices of students, the shuffle of papers, and the daily challenges of the classroom, had become eerily quiet. She had tried to fill the void. Gardening, book clubs, even a trip to Paris last fall, but nothing seemed to shake the sense of purposelessness that had settled over her like a heavy blanket. That was when she had heard about the shelter. A friend from church had mentioned it, a place in the heart of the city where volunteers could make a real difference. At first, Clara had dismissed the idea. She wasn't sure she had the energy or the strength to be around people who were struggling so much. But the thought had lingered, growing in her mind until she found herself reaching for the phone one evening, dialing the number to sign up. Today was her first day. The shelter was a far cry from the neatly ordered classroom where Clara had spent most of her life. The building was old, worn down by years of use and neglect. The smell of disinfectant mixed with something earthy hung in the air as Clara stepped inside, clutching her bag a little tighter. She had no idea what to expect. A young woman with a warm smile greeted her at the front desk. "You must be Ms. Evans, right? We're so glad to have you here." Clara smiled nervously, her heart fluttering in her chest. "Please, just Clara," she said. The title of Ms. Evans felt strange now, like a relic of a life she had left behind. The young woman, Emily, according to her name tag, led Clara through the shelter, showing her the kitchen where volunteers were busy preparing meals, the common area where people gathered to talk and rest, and the rooms where those in need could stay for the night. The place was bustling with activity, but there was a quiet undercurrent of despair that Clara could feel, like a weight pressing down on her chest. "I'll introduce you to some of the other volunteers later," Emily said as they reached the main dining area, "but feel free to jump in wherever you feel comfortable." Clara nodded, her eyes scanning the room. She saw a group of older men sitting at one of the tables, deep in conversation. A young mother rocked a crying baby in her arms, her face drawn with exhaustion. And then, near the back of the room, Clara's gaze landed on a figure that made her breath catch in her throat. He was sitting alone, his head bowed as he stared into a cup of coffee. His clothes were rumpled, his hair unkempt. But it wasn't his appearance that struck her. It was the familiarity of him. She knew that face. "David?" The name slipped from her lips before she could stop it. The man looked up, his eyes widening in shock as they met hers. "Ms. Evans?" Clara's heart pounded in her chest. It was him. David, one of her best students, one of the brightest minds she had ever taught. But what was he doing here? How had he ended up in a place like this? The silence between Clara and David stretched, thick with unspoken questions. For a moment, they simply stared at each other. Clara, unable to reconcile the promising young student she remembered with the man sitting before her, and David, clearly embarrassed to be found in this state. David broke the silence first, his voice rough and low. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," he said, glancing down at his cup as if ashamed. He gave a small, sad smile, one that never reached his eyes. Clara's throat tightened. This was a boy she had once believed would change the world, a boy who had excelled in her class, brimming with potential and ambition. "David," she whispered, her voice filled with disbelief. "What happened? How did you end up here?" David sighed heavily, the weight of years pressing down on his shoulders. He looked around as if checking to make sure no one was listening, then motioned for Clara to sit across from him. "I don't even know where to start," he muttered. It didn't go the way I thought it would." Clara took a seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, waiting. She could feel the raw pain in his words. This wasn't going to be an easy story to hear. David glanced up, meeting her eyes for a brief moment before looking away again. "After I graduated, things were fine at first. I went to college, got a good job, but then everything started falling apart." David's voice faded into the background as Clara's mind drifted, imagining the path he had once walked. She remembered the way his eyes had lit up when he talked about his dreams of becoming an engineer. He had been accepted to one of the best universities, and everyone had expected great things from him. But as David began recounting his story, the picture grew darker. His father had fallen ill during his second year of college, and the medical bills piled up. David, unable to keep up with both his studies and his family's financial burden, dropped out to help at home. The stress mounted, and in a moment of desperation, he took a risk, one that would cost him everything. "I got involved with the wrong people," David said quietly, his hands trembling slightly as he spoke. "I thought I could make quick money, just enough to get my family back on their feet, but it didn't work out that way." He didn't need to elaborate for Clara to understand what he meant. The weight of poor decisions had led him down a path from which there was no easy escape. "I lost everything," David continued, his voice barely a whisper. "The job, my family, even myself." Clara sat in stunned silence, her heart breaking for the man in front of her. This wasn't the David she knew, but it was clear that life had taken its toll on him in ways she couldn't have imagined. She felt an overwhelming need to help him, to do something, anything, to pull him out of the depths he had fallen into. But how? Where could she even begin? Before she could speak, David stood up suddenly, as if the weight of the conversation had become too much to bear. "I'm sorry," he said quickly, not meeting her eyes. "I shouldn't have unloaded all that on you. I didn't mean to." "David, wait," Clara said, reaching out to stop him. "You don't have to apologize. You've been through so much, and you're not alone. I'm here. I want to help." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "I don't know if anyone can help me now," he muttered, "but thank you." And with that, David turned and walked away, leaving Clara sitting there, her mind racing with thoughts about what she could do to help. Later that night, Clara sat in her small apartment, staring out the window as the city lights flickered in the distance. Her mind kept replaying the conversation she'd had with David, her heart heavy with the realization that one of her brightest students had been reduced to this. She couldn't just walk away, not from him, not from the shelter. Clara had always believed in second chances, and if there was ever a time for one, it was now. She picked up her phone and dialed the number for Emily, the shelter coordinator. "Emily," Clara said, her voice firm with determination. "I want to come in tomorrow. I have an idea." As Clara hung up the phone, she couldn't help but feel a spark of hope. It was faint, fragile, but it was there. Tomorrow she would go back to the shelter, and she wouldn't leave until she found a way to help David, not just survive, but thrive again. But what she didn't know was that David was hiding a secret, one that could destroy everything they were about to build. The next morning, Clara arrived at the shelter earlier than usual. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the streets were still quiet, the hum of the city yet to start its day. But Clara felt an urgency she hadn't known in years, a fire ignited by the chance to make a difference, not just for David, but for everyone who walked through those shelter doors. She found Emily sorting through a stack of donated clothes in the back office. "Clara, you're early," Emily said, surprised. "What's on your mind?" Clara hesitated for only a second before speaking. "I want to do more. I'm not just here to serve meals or clean up. I want to help people rebuild their lives." Emily looked at Clara with a mixture of admiration and concern. "That's a big ask. A lot of the people here are dealing with more than just homelessness. addiction, mental health issues, trauma. It's not easy. Clara nodded. I know. But if we can start with small steps, maybe we can give them the tools to get back on their feet. Emily studied her for a moment, then smiled. I think that's exactly what we need around here. For the next few days, Clara threw herself into her new role. She wasn't just handing out meals anymore. She was talking to the people at the shelter, learning their stories, understanding what they needed. Slowly, she started to develop a plan. Workshops, Clara said one evening to Emily and a few of the other volunteers. We could start offering classes on basic life skills, budgeting, resume building, interview techniques, things that can help people get back into the workforce. Emily leaned back in her chair, considering the idea. It's ambitious, she said finally, but I like it. We can start small, see how it goes. Clara expected to see David at the shelter every day, but he was avoiding her. She could feel it, the way he stayed on the periphery, never quite meeting her eyes. He would come in for a meal, then leave without saying much. It wasn't until she cornered him in the hallway one afternoon that they finally had a chance to talk. David, wait, Clara said, stepping in front of him. You've been avoiding me. David shifted uncomfortably. I don't want to be a burden. You're not a burden, Clara said firmly. You're part of the reason I'm here. I want to help you, David. He shook his head, looking away. I don't think you can. I'm too far gone. No one is too far gone, Clara said, her voice soft but resolute. I've seen too many lives turned around to believe that. But I can't help you if you won't let me. David hesitated, his eyes filled with uncertainty. What do you want from me? I want you to come to the workshops we're starting, Clara said. I want you to give yourself a chance. He looked at her for a long moment, then finally nodded. All right, I'll come. The following week, the first workshop was scheduled. Clara stood in front of a small group of shelter residents, her hands slightly shaking from nerves. It had been years since she'd stood in front of a class, and though this wasn't a classroom, the same energy buzzed in the air. David was there, sitting in the back, his arms crossed as if he was trying to shield himself from the experience. Clara noticed him, but didn't push. The first class was on resume building. Clara walked the group through the basics, explaining how to highlight transferable skills, how to structure a resume for different types of jobs. The attendees were engaged, asking questions, taking notes, but not David. He sat quietly, his gaze distant, as if he was in the room but not truly present. Later that evening, as Clara was cleaning up after the workshop, David approached her. I don't think I can do this, he said quietly, his voice heavy with defeat. Clara paused, turning to face him. What do you mean? David's eyes were filled with frustration. I've tried, Clara. I've tried to get a job. Every time I get turned away. No one wants to hire someone like me, someone with my history. Clara's heart sank. She hadn't realized just how deep David's despair went. David, it's not going to be easy, but that doesn't mean it's impossible. He shook his head, looking away. I don't know. I don't know if I have it in me to keep trying. Clara stepped closer, her voice gentle but firm. You don't have to do this alone. I'm here, and so are the others. We're in this together. David didn't respond immediately, but Clara could see the conflict in his eyes, the pull between wanting to believe her and the fear of failure that had gripped him for so long. Finally he nodded, though his expression was still clouded with doubt. All right, I'll try. Word about the workshop spread quickly through the shelter. More people started showing up, eager to learn, to improve their chances of getting back on their feet. Clara, energized by the growing momentum, began planning more sessions, job interview techniques, personal finance management, even basic computer skills. The shelter was buzzing with new hope, and Clara could feel the shift in the air. But as the movement grew, so did the challenges. Some people weren't happy about the changes. A few of the regulars at the shelter grumbled that the workshops were a waste of time, that no amount of education could fix their broken lives. Others were skeptical of Clara's intentions, whispering that she was only there to ease her own guilt, not to help them. And then there was David. Despite attending the workshops, he remained distant, as if he were waiting for something to go wrong, for the ground to fall out from under him once again. One evening, as Clara was locking up after a long day, she heard voices in the back alley behind the shelter. Curious, she stepped outside only to find David in the middle of a heated argument with a man she didn't recognize. The tension between them was palpable, their voices low but angry. Clara couldn't make out what they were saying, but the moment David noticed her, he stepped away from the man, his face pale. "It's nothing," he said quickly, avoiding her eyes. "Just nothing." But Clara wasn't convinced. As David hurried past her and into the shelter, she felt a knot of dread forming in her chest. David was hiding something that could undo everything they were working toward. Clara woke up with a sense of unease the next morning. David's late-night argument in the alley played on a loop in her mind. His expression, the fear and urgency, was not something she could ignore. Despite his assurances, Clara knew there was more to the story, something he wasn't telling her. And yet, she couldn't pry. Not yet. She needed to focus on the work they had started, the movement they were building inside that shelter. The workshops were growing, the shelter abuzz with the energy of people who had begun to believe that change was possible. Clara's ideas were catching on. Volunteers from the community offered their time, local businesses donated supplies, and people started to talk about what they were doing. But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that a storm was coming. As more people from the shelter joined the workshops, Clara noticed something extraordinary. It wasn't just that they were learning new skills, people were changing. Some, like a young mother named Sarah, began showing up early to help set up chairs and tables. Others, like an older man named Fred, started offering to mentor the younger participants, sharing his own experiences of working in construction before he lost his job and his home. David, despite his initial reluctance, was also becoming more involved. He showed up regularly, sometimes taking notes, other times silently watching. Slowly, he started contributing, offering insights during job interview workshops, even helping some of the younger men refine their resumes. Clara watched him carefully, noting the subtle transformation. But still, there was a wall between them, something he kept hidden. Whenever she brought up that night in the alley, he brushed it off, claiming it was just a misunderstanding. But Clara wasn't so sure. As the movement within the shelter grew, so did the outside interest. Local media picked up the story, a retired teacher turning a struggling shelter into a beacon of hope. The attention was mostly positive, but not everyone was on board. Some in the community questioned the validity of Clara's methods. They whispered that she was a privileged outsider who didn't truly understand the struggles of the people she was trying to help. One evening, as Clara was finishing a workshop on personal finance, a woman approached her, her expression hard. "You think this is going to fix everything?" the woman asked, crossing her arms. Her voice was sharp, filled with skepticism. "These people don't need more lectures. They need real help." Clara blinked, taken aback. "We're doing what we can to give people the tools to rebuild their lives." The woman snorted. "Tools? Tools won't fix what's broken in them. You're wasting your time." Before Clara could respond, the woman turned and left, leaving a cloud of doubt in her wake. The words lingered in Clara's mind, gnawing at her as she packed up her things. Were they really making a difference? Was this enough? That night, Clara found herself unable to sleep. The woman's words had hit a nerve. She kept replaying the moment over and over, wondering if there was a truth in what she had said. But more than that, Clara couldn't shake the image of David in the alley. Something was wrong, and Clara needed to know what. The next day, she waited for David to show up at the shelter. He arrived as usual, but this time Clara didn't let him slip away after the workshop. "David, can we talk?" she asked, her voice gentle but firm. David hesitated, glancing around. About what? Clara gestured to a nearby table, away from the others. About what happened the other night. Who was that man? Why were you arguing? David's face darkened. He sat down heavily, running a hand through his hair. It's nothing, Clara. Just someone from my past. It doesn't matter. It does matter, Clara pressed. If it's affecting you, it affects everything we're trying to build here. David stared at her for a long moment, his jaw clenched. Then, as if something inside him broke, he exhaled and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want to drag you into it, but I owe you the truth. Clara felt a chill run through her. What is it? David's voice dropped to a near whisper. I was involved in something illegal before I came to the shelter. When I lost everything, my job, my family, I got desperate. I started doing things I'm not proud of, things that could land me in serious trouble. Clara's heart sank, but she kept her expression calm. What kind of trouble? David swallowed hard. I owe people money. Dangerous people. And that man you saw? He's one of them. Clara felt the weight of his words settle like a stone in her chest. This wasn't just about rebuilding David's life anymore. This was about survival. Her mind raced with possibilities. If David was in danger, what did that mean for the shelter? For the movement they were building? Before she could say anything, David stood up, his eyes filled with regret. I shouldn't have told you. I should have just left. No, David, wait. Clara reached out, but he was already walking away, disappearing into the night. Clara sat there, her thoughts swirling in a storm of uncertainty and fear. She had made a promise to help him, but how could she protect him from something like this? And what would happen if these people found out where he was? The movement was gaining momentum, but Clara realized that with David's secret now in the open, everything they had worked for could come crashing down. Clara couldn't sleep that night. David's words echoed in her mind, each one pulling her deeper into a web of fear and doubt. She had known he was struggling, but she hadn't realized just how deep the trouble ran. And now, his past had the potential to tear down everything they had built together. As the first light of dawn crept through her window, Clara made a decision. She wasn't going to let David face this alone, but she also couldn't allow the shelter to be caught in the crossfire. She needed a plan. When Clara arrived at the shelter that morning, it was quieter than usual. The volunteers were busy in the kitchen, but there was a noticeable tension in the air. David was there too, standing near the entrance looking like a man on the edge of a decision. Clara approached him, her heart heavy. We need to talk, she said quietly. David looked at her, his eyes dark with exhaustion. Clara, No, she interrupted. You need to hear me out first. She led him to a small office in the back, away from the prying eyes of the others. Once the door was closed, Clara turned to face him. I know you're scared, and I understand why you didn't tell me sooner. But this isn't something you can run from. David sighed, sinking into the chair. I know, he admitted, but what choice do I have? These people, they don't just walk away because I want them to. Clara's mind raced, trying to piece together a solution. We'll figure something out, she said, her voice resolute. But you need to trust me. You're not alone in this. David gave her a tired smile, though the fear still lingered in his eyes. I don't want to drag you or the shelter into this mess. Clara sat across from him, leaning forward. This isn't just about you, David. It's about everyone here. What we're building, it's bigger than both of us. But we can't do it if you're constantly looking over your shoulder. David nodded slowly, the weight of his secret still pressing down on him. I'll figure something out, he said quietly. The shelter continued its work, but the atmosphere had shifted. Clara could sense it. The energy was still there, but so was the uncertainty. As the workshops grew and more people began attending, Clara started receiving phone calls. anonymous ones, the kind that sent chills down her spine. It started with vague warnings. You should be careful who you let into your shelter. Then the threats became more direct. We know who you're protecting. This won't end well for either of you. Clara's hand shook every time she hung up the phone, but she didn't tell anyone. Not yet. She couldn't afford to let fear control her actions. The work they were doing was too important. But the threats were a constant reminder of the danger lurking in the background, and it was only a matter of time before something happened. 1 week later, it happened. The shelter was full that day. People gathering for another workshop, volunteers working tirelessly in the kitchen. Clara was standing at the front preparing to begin the session when the door to the shelter slammed open. 2 men walked in, their eyes cold and unfeeling. Clara's heart stopped when she saw them. They looked out of place in the shelter with their sharp suits and hard expressions. David noticed them too, and Clara could see the panic flash across his face. One of the men spoke first, his voice low but commanding. "We're looking for David." Clara stepped forward instinctively, her heart pounding. "This is a public shelter. You have no right to come in here and make demands." The man's gaze turned icy. "You're protecting him," he said, his words laced with menace. "That's a mistake." David stood up slowly from the back of the room, his face pale. "I'll go," he said, his voice trembling. "Just leave everyone else out of this." Clara's stomach twisted. She couldn't let him walk out like this, but she knew that confronting the men directly could escalate the situation. "David, no." But before she could finish, the men turned and left, as quickly as they had arrived. The room fell into a tense silence, everyone staring at David, waiting for him to explain. Later that evening, Clara sat with David in the shelter's small office, the weight of the day pressing down on both of them. "You can't keep running from this," Clara said, her voice filled with a mixture of frustration and concern. "These people won't stop. If you don't face this head-on, they'll never leave you alone." David buried his face in his hands. "I don't know what to do, Clara. I thought I could escape it, but it's catching up with me." Clara's mind raced. She knew what was right. David needed to confront the people he owed, to make things right. But the risk was enormous. If things went wrong, it could destroy not only him but the shelter and everything they'd worked for. "Maybe it's time to talk to the authorities," Clara suggested cautiously. "You can't handle this alone." David shook his head vehemently. "I can't. If I do, they'll retaliate. They'll hurt people." Clara's heart sank. This wasn't just a moral dilemma anymore. It was a matter of survival. She knew David was right. These people operated outside the law, and going to the authorities could make things worse. But what other option did they have? That night, as Clara lay awake in bed, she realized that the time had come to make a difficult decision. She couldn't keep David safe forever, but she couldn't abandon him either. She had to find a way to protect both him and the shelter, but the path ahead was uncertain, filled with risks she couldn't fully predict. The next morning, Clara stood at the front of the shelter, her mind made up. She called David over, her expression grim. "I found someone who might be able to help," she said quietly. "But it's risky. Very risky." David looked at her, confusion and hope flickering in his eyes. "Who?" Clara hesitated for a moment before responding. "Someone I know from my past. Someone who knows how to deal with people like this." David's brow furrowed. "You're sure?" Clara nodded, her stomach churning with uncertainty. "It's our best shot." As they prepared to meet this mysterious contact, Clara couldn't help but wonder if she had just made the worst mistake of her life. Or the decision that would save everything. Clara stood outside the small cafe in a part of town she hadn't visited in years. It was early morning, the kind of hour where the streets were mostly empty, save for a few commuters and delivery trucks. Her stomach churned with anxiety, not just about what was coming, but about the person she was waiting for. The cafe door swung open, and Clara saw him. Marcus. He hadn't changed much since the last time they'd spoken nearly a decade ago. Tall, sharp-eyed, with a quiet intensity that always made him seem 2 steps ahead of everyone else. Back in the day, he'd been involved in some shady circles. Nothing illegal, at least not that Clara knew of, but he understood how to navigate dangerous situations. Marcus caught her eye and walked over, his expression neutral but curious. "Clara Evans," he said, sitting down across from her. "Didn't expect to hear from you after all these years. What brings you back into my world?" Clara swallowed, the weight of her decision pressing down on her. "I need your help, Marcus. It's serious." Over the next hour, Clara explained everything: David's involvement with dangerous people, the growing threats against the shelter, and the impossible situation they now found themselves in. Marcus listened quietly, his eyes narrowing as she spoke, taking in every detail. When she finished, there was a long pause before Marcus finally spoke. "You're in deeper than I thought," he said, his voice low. "And if these people are who I think they are, you're right to be worried. They don't just walk away because someone asks them nicely." Clara's heart sank. She had hoped somehow that Marcus would have a simple solution, a way to make this all go away. But deep down, she knew it wasn't going to be that easy. "So what do we do?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her. "There's only one way to handle people like this," he said finally. "You don't fight them directly. You give them something they want. And then you make sure they have no reason to come back." Clara frowned. "But David doesn't have anything to give them. He's broke, and even if he could pay them off, what's to stop them from coming back later?" Marcus nodded, as if he had anticipated the question. "That's why it has to be more than money. They need to believe that staying away from him, and you, is in their best interest. That means leverage." Clara's pulse quickened. "What kind of leverage?" Marcus's eyes darkened. "Information. Something that gives you power over them." Later that day, Clara met David at the shelter. The tension between them was palpable. David had been on edge since the confrontation with the men a week ago, and Clara's request for him to trust Marcus had only added to his anxiety. "What did he say?" David asked, his voice tight with worry. Clara hesitated before responding. "He thinks we need leverage, something that will convince them to back off for good." David frowned. "Leverage? What kind of leverage?" Clara sighed. "Information. Something that will make them realize it's not worth coming after you anymore." David shook his head, frustration boiling over. "I don't have any information. All I have are debts, and I'm already drowning in them." Clara placed a hand on his arm, trying to calm him. "I know. But Marcus knows how these people operate. If anyone can help, it's him." David pulled away, pacing the small office. "I don't know, Clara. I don't know if I can do this." Clara watched him, her heart breaking for the man who had once been her brightest student. "David, you don't have to face this alone. We'll figure it out together." But David wasn't convinced. "And what if this blows up in our faces? What if they come after the shelter? After you?" Clara's resolve hardened. "Then we'll be ready." The plan Marcus had laid out was risky, but it was the only one they had. Over the next few days, Marcus began digging into the organization that David had fallen into debt with. It didn't take long for him to uncover some crucial details: names, addresses, and connections that led back to some of the more powerful figures in the city's underground world. Clara didn't want to know how Marcus got the information. She only cared that it would help them. One evening, as Clara and Marcus met in secret, Marcus laid out the final pieces of the plan. "I've arranged a meeting with one of their top guys," he said, his voice calm and steady. "We'll present the information we have, and we'll make it clear that if they come after David again, this goes public." Clara felt a chill run down her spine. "And you think that will work?" Marcus nodded. "It will. These people don't want attention. As long as they know we can ruin them, they'll back off. But Clara knew it wasn't that simple. There were still so many variables, so many things that could go wrong. And David, he wasn't just scared for himself, he was scared for everyone at the shelter. The day of the meeting arrived. Clara, Marcus, and David stood outside a dimly lit bar on the edge of the city, waiting for their contact to arrive. The tension was thick, the air heavy with the weight of what was about to happen. David looked pale, his hands shaking as he stood next to Clara. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Clara placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "It's our only shot." As they waited, the door to the bar opened and a man stepped out. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with an air of authority that immediately set Clara on edge. This was the man they were supposed to meet. Marcus stepped forward, his expression unreadable. "We've got what you want," he said, his voice low. "But first, we need to talk." The man's eyes flicked between Marcus, Clara, and David, his gaze cold and calculating. "You think you can play this game with us?" he asked, his voice laced with danger. Marcus didn't flinch. "You don't have a choice," he said. "Walk away from David, and you'll never hear from us again. Push this, and we'll make sure your name is everywhere." The man stared at them for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he smiled. A slow, dangerous smile that sent a chill down Clara's spine. "You've got guts," he said quietly. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Clara, David, and Marcus standing in the alley, the weight of his words hanging in the air like a dark cloud. Clara's heart pounded in her chest. They had made their move, but it was clear that the danger wasn't gone. In fact, it might have just begun. Clara had always believed that doing the right thing would lead to the right outcome. But as she sat in the shelter the day after the confrontation, watching David pace back and forth, the weight of uncertainty crushed her usual optimism. Their stand against the men who had threatened David hadn't gone unnoticed. The quiet tension in the air told her that this was far from over. The shelter buzzed with activity as people filed in for the afternoon workshop, but Clara's mind was elsewhere. She glanced at her phone every few minutes, waiting for a call or a text, anything from Marcus to let her know the situation hadn't worsened. David, pale and clearly shaken from the previous night, finally stopped pacing. "I should have never dragged you into this," he muttered, his voice filled with regret. "You didn't sign up for this kind of trouble." Clara shook her head firmly. "We're in this together. You don't have to handle it alone anymore." As days passed, the shelter became a target, not from the dangerous people who threatened David, but from a more insidious force: doubt. The media attention that had once praised their work had turned. Anonymous calls started flooding in, questioning the integrity of their movement, hinting that something was rotten at the core of the shelter. "They're trying to smear us," Clara said one evening to Emily and the volunteers. They had gathered in a small meeting room, the tension in the air palpable. Emily's face was tight with worry. "We can't afford this kind of bad press. People are going to stop supporting us." One of the volunteers, a man named Fred who had been instrumental in setting up the workshops, leaned forward. "What do they think is going on? We're doing good work here." Clara sighed. "It's not about what's true. It's about planting doubt. People see headlines, rumors. They don't care about the facts." Emily frowned. "So what do we do?" Clara glanced at David, who sat quietly in the corner, the weight of his secret still pressing down on him. "We stay the course," she said firmly. "We keep doing what we're doing. They want to scare us into stopping, and we can't let them win." But even as Clara spoke the words, she knew it wouldn't be easy. The threats were real, and David's past was still looming over everything like a shadow waiting to be unleashed. As the weeks passed, Clara noticed a shift among the people at the shelter. Despite the mounting pressure from outside forces, those who had attended the workshops were beginning to change. Lives were being rebuilt, one step at a time. Sarah, the young mother who had been struggling with homelessness for months, had found a part-time job. Fred had managed to reconnect with his estranged daughter, a reconciliation that had seemed impossible just a few months earlier. These small victories became the foundation on which Clara built her resolve. Even as the outside world tried to tear them down, inside the shelter, hope was growing. One afternoon, after a particularly successful workshop, David approached Clara. His expression was softer, though the worry still lingered in his eyes. "I think I can do this," he said quietly, almost as if testing the words. I think I can actually make a new start." Clara smiled, a wave of relief washing over her. "You already are, David. Look around. You're part of something bigger than you ever imagined." David glanced at the people around him. Sarah helping to clean up after the workshop, Fred chatting with a group of younger men, and for the first time in a long while, Clara saw a flicker of hope in his eyes. But just as quickly, the hope faded. "What if they come back?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "What if they don't leave me alone?" Clara's heart ached for him. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing. They couldn't live in fear forever. "We'll face it when it comes," she said gently, "and we'll face it together." The next morning, Clara's phone buzzed with a message that sent her heart racing. It was from Marcus. "We need to meet. Urgent." Clara's pulse quickened as she hurried to the cafe where they had met before. When she arrived, Marcus was already there, his expression grim. "They didn't back off," he said without preamble, his eyes locked on hers. "I thought the information would be enough to make them disappear, but I was wrong. They're more dangerous than I realized." Clara's heart sank. "What does that mean? What are they planning?" Marcus leaned forward, his voice low. "They're coming after David. They don't care about the shelter anymore. They want him, and they're not going to stop until they get what they want." Clara felt a wave of nausea rise in her throat. "What do we do?" Marcus glanced around as if making sure no one was listening. "There's only one way out of this," he said, his voice grave. "We have to make a deal with them." Clara shook her head, her mind reeling. "A deal? You said they wouldn't walk away, that they can't be trusted." "I know," Marcus said, his voice tight. "But this is different. If we don't do something now, David's in real danger, and if they come after him, there's no telling who else they'll hurt." Clara found herself standing at the edge of an impossible decision. Marcus's plan was dangerous. It involved negotiating with people who had already proven themselves to be ruthless. But what choice did they have? If they didn't act, David's life was at risk. That night, Clara sat alone in her apartment, her thoughts swirling. She had always believed in doing the right thing, even when it was hard. But this wasn't just about right and wrong. This was about survival. She thought about the shelter, about the people who depended on it, about the movement they had started together. If they lost David, it would all come crashing down. And yet, the idea of making a deal with these people, it felt like crossing a line she wasn't sure she could ever come back from. The next morning, Clara made her decision. She met Marcus outside the shelter, her heart pounding in her chest. "We'll do it," she said quietly, the weight of her choice pressing down on her. "But only if we have no other option. I'm not losing David, and I'm not losing the shelter." Marcus nodded, his expression serious. "I'll set it up. But you need to be ready, Clara. This could go south fast." Clara's stomach twisted with dread, but she knew there was no turning back. They were about to walk into a storm, and she could only hope that they would come out the other side. Clara sat in the back of Marcus's car, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The city lights blurred past the window as they drove deeper into the industrial district. The air inside the car was thick with tension, every second that passed adding to the growing knot in Clara's stomach. She had made the decision to go through with Marcus's plan, but the weight of that choice hung over her like a storm cloud. David sat beside her, silent and pale. His jaw was clenched, his hands resting on his knees, shaking slightly. Clara glanced at him, her heart aching for what this moment meant for him. If this went wrong, everything could unravel. His life, the shelter, everything they had worked for. "You don't have to do this," she said softly, breaking the silence. "We can still find another way." David shook his head, his voice hoarse. "There is no other way, Clara. I have to face this. If I don't, they'll never stop coming for me. For us." Marcus kept his eyes on the road, his expression unreadable. "This meeting is our best shot, but it has to be handled carefully. These guys don't play games." Clara swallowed hard, her mind racing. The plan was simple in theory. Meet with the leader of the group that had been after David, offer them the information Marcus had gathered, and negotiate a way out. But the risks were staggering. If the meeting went wrong, they could all end up in deeper trouble than they had ever imagined. They arrived at a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where deals were made and secrets were buried. Marcus parked the car and turned to Clara and David. "Stay calm. Let me do most of the talking. And whatever you do, don't show fear." Clara nodded, but inside her nerves were frayed. She followed Marcus and David out of the car, her legs feeling like they might give out at any moment. As they approached the entrance to the warehouse, two men appeared from the shadows, their expressions hard and unfriendly. "Marcus," one of them said, his voice flat, "we've been expecting you." Marcus nodded, his posture relaxed but alert. "Let's make this quick." They were led inside, the dark, echoing space of the warehouse sending a shiver down Clara's spine. In the center of the room stood the man they had come to meet, a tall, imposing figure with a face that seemed carved from stone. His eyes were cold, calculating, and the tension in the room was palpable. "You've got some nerve coming here," the man said, his voice low and dangerous. His gaze flicked to David, and his lip curled in disdain. "I've been looking for you." David tensed beside Clara, but Marcus stepped forward, his voice steady. "We've got what you want. Information that'll make sure you stay out of trouble. But we need to talk terms." The man's eyes narrowed. "Terms? You think you're in a position to negotiate with me?" Marcus remained calm. "I think you'll want to hear what we have to offer before you make any decisions." For a long moment, the man said nothing. Then, with a wave of his hand, he signaled for his men to back off. "Fine. Talk." Marcus reached into his jacket and pulled out a small envelope, handing it to the man. "This is everything we've got on you and your operation. It's more than enough to get you and your people in deep with the law. You leave David alone, and this information stays buried." The man took the envelope, his expression darkening as he glanced inside. He let out a slow, dangerous laugh. "You think this scares me? I've dealt with worse." Marcus didn't flinch. "Maybe, but this isn't just about you. It's about your people. You don't want them getting caught in your mess, do you?" The man's smile faded, replaced by a hard glare. He stepped closer to Marcus, his voice low and menacing. "You don't get to make demands. Not in my world." Clara's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the exchange. The tension in the room was suffocating, and for a moment she thought everything was about to fall apart. But Marcus remained steady, his eyes locked on the man in front of him. "You're right," Marcus said quietly. "This isn't my world, but it doesn't have to be. Take the deal and you walk away clean. Push this and things get messy. For everyone." The man stared at Marcus for a long moment, the silence in the warehouse stretching thin. Clara held her breath waiting for the hammer to fall. But then, finally, the man nodded slowly. "Fine," he said, his voice cold. "We're done here. But remember this. Next time, there won't be any deals. You cross me again, and I'll make sure you regret it." As they walked out of the warehouse and back to the car, Clara could hardly believe what had just happened. The tension still hung in the air, but the immediate danger had passed. They had made it through the meeting without bloodshed, and for the first time in weeks, there was a glimmer of hope. David exhaled shakily, his shoulders slumping with relief. "I can't believe that worked," he muttered. Marcus gave him a sideways glance. "It worked for now. But don't think this is over. You need to keep your head down, David. This is your second chance. Don't waste it." Clara nodded, her mind still racing. "We need to be careful from here on out. The shelter can't afford any more attention, and neither can you." David looked at her, his expression softening. "Thank you, Clara, for everything. I wouldn't have made it this far without you." Clara smiled, though her heart still carried the weight of what had just transpired. "We're not done yet. There's still a lot of work to do." The days that followed the meeting felt like a calm after the storm. Clara, David, and the shelter returned to their routine, though there was a renewed sense of purpose in everything they did. The workshops continued to grow, and the people who had once been on the brink of despair were starting to find their footing again. David, now free from the immediate threat, threw himself into the work at the shelter with a new energy. He wasn't just attending workshops anymore, he was leading them, helping others find the same hope that had once been offered to him. The media attention that had once been a burden shifted again, this time in their favor. Stories of transformation and success started to surface, and the shelter became a symbol of hope in a city that had once turned its back on the most vulnerable. But even as things improved, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that they were still walking on thin ice. The deal they had made had bought them time, but it hadn't erased the danger completely. She knew that one wrong move could bring everything crashing down again. One evening, as Clara was locking up the shelter, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from an unknown number. She opened it, her heart skipping a beat as she read the words on the screen. "We're not finished yet." Clara's blood ran cold. The message was short, but the meaning was clear. The threat wasn't over. Despite everything they had done, despite the deal they had made, the danger was still lurking in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. As Clara stood alone in the darkened shelter, she realized that the fight for the shelter, for David's future, and for everything they had built wasn't over. Not yet. Clara sat at her kitchen table, staring at the message on her phone. "We're not finished yet." The words sent a chill down her spine, even though the room around her was warm and still. She had known deep down that the deal with Marcus wouldn't make everything disappear, but she had hoped, naively, that it would buy them more time. Now, the threat was back, and this time it was even more dangerous. She didn't sleep that night. Her mind raced with scenarios of what could happen next, how the people targeting David could destroy everything they had built at the shelter. She knew that they had to act fast. But what could they do? They had already made one deal. Could they survive making another? The next morning, Clara found herself standing in front of Marcus's office before the sun had even risen. She knocked, her heart pounding. When Marcus opened the door, his face was a mask of calm, but Clara could see the flicker of concern in his eyes. "You saw the message?" Clara asked, her voice tight with anxiety. Marcus nodded, stepping aside to let her in. "I knew it wouldn't end with one meeting. These people don't just walk away, Clara. They see David as a loose end, and as long as he's out there, they'll keep coming." Clara sank into a chair, running a hand through her hair. "Then what do? We can't keep playing their game. It'll destroy the shelter and it'll destroy David." Marcus sat across from her, leaning forward. "We don't play their game. We take the fight to them." Clara's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean?" Marcus's eyes darkened. "We've been on the defensive since this whole thing started. Now it's time to go on the offensive. We gather evidence, real evidence on these guys, not just enough to keep them quiet, but enough to take them down. Permanently." Clara's mind reeled. "That's dangerous, Marcus. These people could come after us harder if they find out." Marcus didn't flinch. "They're going to come after us anyway. This is our only shot." Back at the shelter, David was hard at work organizing a workshop when Clara found him. She watched him from across the room, noticing how much he had changed since their first encounter. He was no longer the broken man hiding in the shadows. He had found his place, his purpose. But even with all his progress, Clara knew he wasn't free. Not yet. "David, we need to talk," Clara said, pulling him aside as the workshop wrapped up. David looked at her, concern flashing in his eyes. "What's wrong?" Clara hesitated for a moment, then told him everything. About the message, about Marcus's plan, about the new danger they faced. As she spoke, David's expression shifted from fear to anger, a quiet rage building inside him. "I'm tired of running," David said, his voice shaking with emotion. "I'm tired of hiding, of always looking over my shoulder. If Marcus is right, if this is the only way to end it, then I'm in." Clara's heart ached for him. She knew how much he had already suffered, and now she was asking him to face his past in a way that could destroy everything. But she also knew there was no other option. "We're in this together," she said quietly. "Whatever happens, we won't let them take this from us." David nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Let's take them down." The days that followed were a blur of tense planning and cautious execution. Marcus used his connections to begin gathering evidence on the group that had been after David. Clara and David worked alongside him, pulling together every piece of information they could find: contacts, transactions, even rumors from the streets. It wasn't easy. Every step they took felt like a dangerous dance on a knife's edge. They had to be careful, avoiding the wrong people, staying under the radar while digging deeper into the underworld that had threatened to consume David. Clara's heart pounded with fear every time she received a call from Marcus. She knew that one wrong move could bring the entire operation crashing down around them. Just as they were beginning to feel like they had enough evidence to make their move, a wrench was thrown into their plans. One evening, as Clara was locking up the shelter, she noticed something off. Fred, the volunteer who had been so instrumental in setting up the workshops, had been acting strangely all day, nervous, avoiding eye contact. As she stepped outside, Clara found Fred pacing near the back of the shelter, his phone pressed to his ear. She stayed hidden, listening to his conversation. "I don't care what Marcus says," Fred whispered harshly into the phone. "I can't do this anymore. They're going to find out. If they find out I'm feeding you information, it's over for me." Clara's blood ran cold. Fred was working with the enemy. She stepped out of the shadows, and Fred nearly dropped his phone when he saw her. "Clara, I can explain." "Explain?" Clara's voice was low, shaking with anger. "You've been selling us out this whole time?" Fred looked panicked, his eyes darting around. "I didn't have a choice. They found me. They threatened me. I had to tell them something, or they would have—" "They would have what?" Clara snapped. "We trusted you, Fred. You were one of us." Fred's shoulders slumped, guilt written across his face. "I'm sorry. I never wanted to hurt anyone." Clara's hands shook as she clenched them into fists. "You've already done enough damage." Clara stormed back into the shelter, her mind racing. She had to tell Marcus and David what she had discovered, but before she could call them, her phone buzzed with another message. It was from the same unknown number as before. "We know what you're planning. It's over." Clara's heart nearly stopped. They had found out. Somehow, despite all their careful planning, the enemy had gotten ahead of them. She called Marcus immediately, her voice shaking. They know everything." Marcus cursed under his breath. "We need to move now. There's no time left." As Clara hung up, her mind reeled. The walls were closing in. They had tried to take the fight to their enemies, but now the tables had turned. The enemy was coming for them, and Clara didn't know if they had enough strength left to fight back. Clara stood in the quiet shelter, the weight of the impending confrontation pressing down on her. The message had made it clear. Their enemies knew everything. The calm before the storm felt suffocating, each minute that passed dragging her closer to the inevitable clash. David and Marcus arrived shortly after Clara called them, both wearing grim expressions. "We need to act fast," Marcus said, cutting straight to the point. "If they're coming for us, we have to be ready." Clara nodded, her nerves frayed but her resolve firm. "What do we do?" Marcus glanced around the shelter, taking in the familiar surroundings. "We make our stand. Right here. We're not running anymore." As night fell, the shelter's doors were locked, and a small group of loyal volunteers stayed behind to help. Sarah, Fred, now remorseful and determined to make up for his betrayal, and a few others huddled inside, preparing for what might come. Clara, though terrified, felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. David paced, his face pale but his eyes resolute. "If this goes wrong—" "We'll get through it," Clara said firmly. "Together." And then the lights outside the shelter flickered. Headlights from several cars pulling up. The enemy had arrived. Marcus tensed. "Stay calm. Remember the plan." The front door burst open, and in walked the man from the warehouse, cold, calculating, with several of his men trailing behind. His eyes locked on David, and a slow, dangerous smile crept across his face. "You thought you could outsmart me?" he sneered, his voice like ice. "I warned you. Now you'll pay the price." Clara stepped forward, her heart pounding but her voice steady. "You're not taking him. Not today." The man's eyes narrowed. "And what are you going to do about it?" Clara stood tall, every ounce of her determination pouring into her words. "We've gathered enough evidence to ruin you and your entire operation. You won't just lose your business, you'll lose everything. Your freedom, your reputation, all of it." The man paused, clearly surprised by Clara's boldness. "You think I'm scared of you? Of some old teacher?" "No," Marcus cut in, stepping forward. "But you should be scared of what's coming next. The evidence we have, it's already in the hands of people who can bring you down. Walk away now, and you still have a chance to salvage something." The room fell into a tense silence. Clara could feel her heart hammering in her chest, but she held her ground, her eyes never leaving the man's cold stare. For a moment it seemed like the man would laugh it off, push forward and turn the situation violent. But then something shifted in his expression. Perhaps it was the realization that Marcus wasn't bluffing. Perhaps it was the growing knowledge that pushing any further would bring consequences he couldn't control. He took a step back, his eyes darkening. "You'll regret this," he spat, his voice low and dangerous. But Clara didn't flinch. I won't." The man glared at David one last time, then turned on his heel and stormed out of the shelter, his men following behind him. The sound of car engines starting up and driving away was the most beautiful sound Clara had heard in weeks. The shelter was quiet again, but the tension that had gripped everyone was finally starting to lift. David sank into a chair, his body shaking with relief. Clara sat beside him, her heart still racing. "We did it," David whispered, almost in disbelief. Clara nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips. "We did." Marcus leaned against the wall, arms crossed, but even he looked relieved. "It's over. For now." Clara knew Marcus was right. Though they had won this battle, the war wasn't entirely over. But they had something they didn't have before. Power. They had stood up to the people who had tried to tear them down, and they had won. And more than that, David was free. Truly free for the first time in years. In the weeks that followed, the shelter became a beacon of hope in the community. Word spread about what had happened, but not in the way Clara feared. Instead of rumors of danger, the story of their victory, of how a group of people stood together against overwhelming odds, inspired others. David became a leader at the shelter, not just attending workshops but running them, mentoring others who were in the same position he had once been in. His transformation was complete, no longer haunted by his past, but empowered by his future. Clara watched with pride as the movement they had started continued to grow. People from all walks of life came to the shelter, not just for help, but to offer help. What began as a small effort to rebuild lives had turned into something much bigger than Clara had ever imagined. One evening, as Clara stood outside the shelter, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance, David approached her. "You saved my life," he said quietly. "I don't know how to thank you." Clara smiled softly. "You saved your own life, David. I just helped you find the way." David chuckled, but his eyes were serious. "I wouldn't be here without you. None of us would." Clara glanced around at the people bustling inside the shelter, the volunteers, the residents, the community they had built. "We're just getting started," she said. "There's still so much more to do." David nodded, his expression filled with hope. "Let's do it." As months passed, the shelter's success continued to spread. It wasn't just a safe haven anymore. It was the heart of a growing movement that inspired others to take action in their own communities. Clara, David, and the team expanded their efforts, opening new programs, partnering with other shelters, and even drawing attention from national organizations. The movement had turned into something far greater than any of them had imagined. But through it all, Clara remained humble. She knew that none of it would have been possible without the people who had come together in the darkest of times to create something beautiful. Clara stood in front of a small crowd, giving a speech at an event celebrating the shelter's one-year anniversary. As she looked out at the faces of those who had been part of the journey, David, Marcus, the volunteers, and the people whose lives had been transformed, she felt a surge of emotion. "We started with nothing but hope," Clara said, her voice filled with warmth. "And now, we have a community. We've learned that no matter how hard life gets, kindness and compassion will always prevail. It's not always easy. There are dark moments, moments when it feels like we might lose, but in the end, the power of kindness is greater than fear, and that's what we stand for." The crowd erupted into applause, but Clara wasn't thinking about accolades. She was thinking about the future, about all the lives they would continue to touch, about the people who would carry the torch long after she was gone. As she stepped down from the stage, David was there to meet her, a wide smile on his face. "You were right," he said. "We're just getting started." Clara smiled, her heart full. "Yes, we are." And with that, the movement continued, growing stronger every day, proof that even in the darkest times hope and kindness could light the way. The shelter was quiet again, the evening sun casting long shadows across the floor as Clara sat by the window, reflecting on the journey they had taken. The battle had been hard fought, filled with twists and moments where everything seemed to hang by a thread. But in the end, they had come out stronger. The shelter was thriving, and the movement had grown beyond anything she could have imagined. The lesson, however, wasn't just about survival. It was about the power of kindness and transformation. David, once lost and broken, had found his purpose. His story, intertwined with Clara's, had become a beacon of hope for so many others. Through their shared struggles, they had proven that even in the darkest times, compassion and determination could ignite a movement capable of changing lives. Clara knew that their story wasn't over. There would always be challenges, always battles to fight, but the foundation they had built was strong, rooted in the belief that no one was too far gone, that every life mattered. Clara's heart was filled with hope. They had stood against impossible odds. They had faced down fear, and in the end, they had won. Not just for themselves, but for everyone who believed in the power of a kindness to transform the world. Their story doesn't end here. The journey of kindness, compassion, and transformation continues. And now it's your turn. Share your own stories of kindness, acts of generosity that have changed your life, or the lives of those around you. Let's build a world where these stories inspire others to take action, to believe in the power of community, and to never give up on the potential for change. Subscribe to stay connected with more stories of transformation, and remember, every act of kindness, no matter how small, can make a difference. Together, we can continue to light the way for those who need it most.